Late summer in Wyoming had a way of pretending to be gentle. The grasslands lay wide open and sunlit, all that gold and sage stretching until the earth seemed to forget where it ended. Heat shimmered off the Clearwater River, as if the water were a long piece of glass laid bright side up, the current steady but carrying a faint bruise of brown from the recent flood upstream. Fence wire hummed when a gust pushed across the pasture. Grasshoppers leapt and clicked, vanishing like pebbles into the blonde sea. It was one of those afternoons when the land felt endless and self-sure, until it didn't. Emma Caldwell rode the fence line at a working trot, the chestnut mare beneath her moving light and easy despite the heat. Sweat had already darkened the mare's withers. The reins felt warm and alive in Emma's gloved hands. A pair of red-tailed hawks made circles above the cottonwoods, and the shadow of their turning wings flickered over the grass like slow lightning. From the saddle, Emma scanned for weak posts, sagging wire, or the telltale scuff of cattle bumping where they shouldn't. The ranch had taken a hit after the flood. Debris lodged in the low pastures, a culvert undermined, a heap of torn willow piled like driftwood bones against a corner brace. Work she could do. Work that made sense. What didn't make sense stood 50 yards off the river in a patch of grass beaten flat as a bed. A wild Mustang stallion, the same one she'd seen for 3 days running in the exact same place by the water. The first day she'd told herself it was chance. Good feed, cool breeze off the river. Any horse might linger. The second day she'd slowed and watched longer, noticing the set of his shoulders and the way his head hung just below the clean line of his neck. Not grazing, not drowsing. Simply suspended there like a held breath. The third day, today, she knew it wasn't chance at all. He was a slate-gray roan with the dusted look of a storm cloud dragged over stone, dapples hidden under a coat smudged by rain and river silt. He carried his scars modestly, a white nick on the shoulder, a healed bite on the crest of his neck from the old language of stallions. He had the kind of frame that made a person think of tensile strength. Nothing wasted, every line built for running and turning and bracing. His ears flicked when the mare's hoof struck a loose rock. He knew she was there. He knew Emma was there. He just didn't move. Emma reined in on the rise and let the mare blow. The wind brushed her face and brought the river's mixed smell of wet cottonwood bark, algae, and mud. It also brought a thin, metallic note she couldn't place right away, like the scent left in the air after lightning. The flood had chewed at the bank in long horizontal bites, undercutting the grass so that sections hung in a green fringe and dropped into brown water. Upstream, a cottonwood lay fallen into the river, its trunk trapped between rocks, branches, and leaves caught in a swept tangle that nodded with the current. He should have had a band with him. This close to late summer, any stallion carved from that much grit ought to be drifting a loose herd across the flats. Mares and a couple of long yearlings, a colt or two tucked on the lee side of bodies when the wind came up. But there was no herd, no restless shifting, no tail-swishing conversation of horses half bored by an afternoon. Just him standing as if the world had narrowed to a single point on the river's edge. The mare shifted under her, listening to the gray. Emma eased a boot from the stirrup and rolled her ankle. She felt the day's miles in the ball of her foot. She told herself to keep moving, to mark the stallion's presence and finish the fence check, to come back later with a plan. Instead, she let the weight of the decision settle, the way she always did, feeling for the thing that was steady and true underneath. The horse had chosen this spot 3 days in a row. He wasn't feeding. He wasn't resting. He was waiting. She pushed the mare forward at a walk, angling toward a stand of willow that would keep her silhouette smaller against the sky. The stallion's head came up an inch, then another. His nostrils flared, gathering what the wind could tell him. He did not spook. He did not square his body to drive her off. He watched. That alone made something cold unroll in Emma's chest. Wild things had rules. Distance, posture, readiness to turn air into muscle and vanish. When they broke their rules, it meant another rule had been broken first. Closer to the river, the flood's aftermath showed itself in 1,000 small ways. A sheet of corrugated tin half buried in the silt. An upended fence post chewed white at the base. Boot-sucking mud where there used to be firm gravel. The water looked harmless enough if a person didn't know better. Sun scattered across its skin, ducks drifting near the far bank. But the current under it carried a quiet, muscular insistence. Roots reached into the flow like fingers not ready to let go. Emma stopped behind the willow and simply watched. The stallion stood with his weight slightly back, as if braced against an invisible pull. His tail hung quiet. A fly landed on his flank and he twitched it off with the slow patience of an animal who has all day and nothing but time. But the eyes, those didn't say patience. Those said heat held in a forge. He kept flicking them toward the fallen cottonwood, toward a ragged nest of branches trapped between the trunk and the bank. Flood debris, she told herself. A jacket from upstream, a shape the water made out of leaves and shadows. Still, her vision kept snagging on it. A gleam where there shouldn't be one. A curve too clean for a stick. She didn't move closer. Not yet. She slid out of the saddle, dropped the reins, and let the mare lower her head for a few mouthfuls of grass. The stallion tracked the motion, but didn't step toward her or away. Emma bowed her head and listened. The river's talk. The cottonwood leaves clattering like coins. Somewhere up the valley, distant thunder, as if the day had cleared its throat. It should have been easy to turn back. She could have marked the place and called it in later. A wild stallion holding strange ground after a flood. Something for a biologist to note, for a ranger to post on a clipboard. But the land she worked didn't lend itself to later. Calves born breech or fences blown down in the night, or damnable quick weather that taught you to act sooner than your worry wanted. So she did what she did best. She found the limits of what she could do right now and pressed to them. She stepped out of the willow's shade into full view. Open hands, shoulders loose, boots placed where the ground held firm. The stallion lifted his neck a fraction more, ears forward. Emma stopped, letting him set the distance. The sunlight picked out the fine ribs of his face and the long, clean brush of his forelock. Dark strands gathered on the plane of his forehead. He didn't pin his ears. He didn't snake his neck. The tail gave one low, measured swish. For a wild horse, he was almost still enough to be carved there. 3 days, she thought. He chose this exact place 3 days in a row. The river took something, and he stayed to watch where it let go. She followed his gaze, tracing past the cottonwood's stained bark, past the mess of branches. The flood had laid down a rim of new silt, bright as clay. On the edge of that, pressed into the soft wet, she saw small half-moons set lightly together, the prints of a young hoof. No, 2. A set angled downstream, and a sharper, shorter set angled nowhere at all, as if the maker had planted all 4 feet and said no to the moving world. The sight tightened Emma's throat. The ground here had told stories for longer than people had language to name them. Today, it was telling one in a voice she didn't want to fully understand. A bottled heat gathered above the river, the kind that makes a person expect the sky to change faster than it should. The hum in the fence behind her rose and fell with a small gust. A dragonfly stitched a bright line along the water, unbothered by anything humans worried about. Emma rubbed the sweat-dark line under her helmet brim with the back of her wrist. She could feel herself leaning into questions and pulling back from answers. The stallion shifted his weight and took a small step toward the cottonwood, as if to remind her where the center of the world currently was. All right, she thought, not in words so much as in the same steady tone she brought to a calving heifer or a yearling's first trailer load. All right. She walked the mare back to higher ground, mounted, and sat a long moment with the reins slack, the river below. The stallion fixed where he'd fixed himself. She had seen grief in animals before. She had watched cows low for calves gone still in the night, seen border collies wait by doors that wouldn't open again. But there was something here that cut a new shape in the air. A guard post built out of loss, a vigil that would not move for weather or time. Emma turned the mare toward the ranch yard at an easy lope, the kind that covered ground without making a point of it. Dust lifted and fell behind them. When she glanced back once from the ridge, the gray roan was exactly where she had left him, the river bending near his feet, the cottonwood holding its wreckage like a hand cupped around a secret. The sun had shifted a degree lower, and the light on his back made him look half made of water. She didn't plan to wait for morning. There were rules she respected, and there were people who knew when to soften the edges of those rules for the sake of a living thing. By the time she swung down in the yard and stripped the tack, she had already decided who to call and what to say. The mare shook, head to tail, and the leather creaked a tired answer. Thunder spoke again, closer now. Emma wiped her hands on a towel, reached for the phone, and went inside to set help in motion. Lucas's truck rolled through the ranch gate just as the late afternoon light began to shift toward evening gold. The hum of his diesel engine faded into the background of cicadas and wind in the cottonwoods. He stepped out, tall and solid, his ball cap shadowing steady eyes that always seemed to weigh and measure before he spoke. A waterproof vet kit hung from one hand, binoculars slung over his shoulder, and a tranquilizer rifle case balanced in the other. Emma met him halfway down the gravel path. "Didn't think you'd get here this fast." "I was already on the highway when you called," he said, setting the rifle case on the hood. "Your voice told me it wasn't just curiosity." They didn't waste time. Emma led the way toward the pasture's southern edge where the river bent. The chestnut mare stayed behind in the corral. This was work better done on foot. The grass was high and damp, tugging at their jeans as they made their way down slope. Lucas lifted his binoculars first. His jaw tightened. "He's not feeding," he murmured, "and he's letting us inside 100 yards without shifting." Emma kept her own voice low. "3 days now. Same spot. No herd." The stallion stood exactly as she'd seen him earlier. Roan hide darkened at the flanks, head angled toward the fallen cottonwood, tail flicking slow, deliberate arcs. His ears twitched in their direction, but never pinned flat. He was aware, watchful, unmoved. Lucas crouched slightly, peering past the cottonwood. "You see that?" Emma followed his line of sight. At first it was nothing but water and debris. Then, a faint sway beneath the tangle of branches, her breath caught. For a moment she thought it was just a branch shifting with the current. But the curve of it, the way a pale flank rolled just under the surface. She took a step forward before stopping herself. "Lucas." He adjusted the focus. Foal, colt, maybe 2 months old. He's tangled in there. His voice was flat, professional, but his eyes gave away the weight of it. The stallion shifted his front feet, closing the distance between them and the cottonwood by a single measured step. His nostrils flared, a low snort rumbling out. Not panic, not threat, but something older. A warning to keep back. Emma's chest tightened. That's why he's here. He's been keeping watch. Guarding the body, Lucas said softly. I've seen it with bonded pairs, but a stallion, this is... He didn't finish. They stood for a long moment in the damp air, the river whispering past, the wind moving in the trees. Lucas finally exhaled. Protocol says we remove the remains, check for disease, toxins. It's part of the report. Emma's gaze stayed on the stallion. Protocol doesn't stand here soaking in the rain because it can't let go. He glanced at her, one eyebrow lifted. You're saying leave him be? I'm saying bury him here, she said. Somewhere close. Somewhere he can see. Lucas hesitated, then nodded. All right, we'll make an exception. They chose a spot under a tall cottonwood just up from the bank. The ground was soft from the flood but stable. Emma fetched a shovel from the fence post cache, and together they worked in silence. The stallion never moving more than a few paces from the water's edge. Each time Emma looked up, his dark eyes were there, fixed, unblinking. When the grave was ready, Lucas waded in knee-deep, careful against the current. The branches gave reluctantly, releasing the small, limp body into his arms. Water streamed from the foal's coat as he carried it ashore. Emma knelt to clear a bed of grass in the grave. The colt's head lolled gently as Lucas laid him down. His legs were folded neatly under him, as if in some quiet sleep. Emma placed a flat river stone over the mound when the last of the soil had been patted down, her gloves streaked with mud. They stepped back. The stallion took 2 slow steps toward the grave, lowering his head until his muzzle hovered just above the fresh earth. The wind lifted his mane, and for a heartbeat the whole world seemed to still, the grass, the water, even the air itself holding quiet. Emma swallowed against the lump in her throat. Lucas shifted beside her but didn't speak. This wasn't a moment for words. When the first rumbles of distant thunder rolled across the horizon, the stallion stayed where he was. The light had already begun to change. That strange pre-storm dimming where the sun burns in one corner of the sky and clouds press in from the other. The wind picked up, tugging at their jackets, rattling the cottonwood leaves overhead like 1,000 small coins. Lucas tapped her arm, tilting his head toward higher ground. We should get back before it breaks. Emma cast one last glance over her shoulder as they climbed the rise. Rain had started to pepper the river's surface, blurring the cottonwood's reflection. The stallion didn't flinch. He stood by the grave, rain darkening his coat, head bowed, the river at his feet. From the ranch porch later, binoculars in hand, Emma watched him still, unmoved by lightning, by thunder, by the lashing rain. Only when the storm deepened enough to turn the land to shadow did she lower the lenses, her throat tight. He wasn't leaving. Night came on like a slow-closing palm, fingers of cloud drawing the last warmth out of the open country. The storm gathered itself with a patience that felt personal, pulling charge out of the air, stacking thunderheads on the mountains until the range looked like it wore a dark, living crown. Wind came first, restless and testing, pushing through the grass so it flowed in braided currents. Then the light shifted into that uneasy half-glow that ranchers recognize, too bright under the clouds, too dim where the land dips. A warning written across the ground. Emma worked the yard without needing to talk. She swung gates, checked latches, pulled the chestnut cinch to dry the sweat mark, and threw a canvas sheet over the saddle to keep it from taking water. Each task snapped into the one after it with the ease of years. She kept glancing toward the river between motions, the way a hand will go to a bruise without thinking. The gray roan was still there. Even at a distance, he cut a sharp line against the bending grass. The kind of stillness that pulls the eye again and again. Vigil. It was the only word that fit. Lucas stowed his gear under the porch awning and ran a towel over the tranquilizer case. He didn't suggest leaving. He didn't reach for platitudes. The work they'd just done sat between them, clean, hard, necessary, and he let it be what it was. When the first heavy drops hit the dust and turned it to dark freckles, he took a pair of binoculars from the truck and gave them to Emma. She didn't say thanks. She set the strap around her neck and lifted the glass. The world across those lenses narrowed and clarified. Rain made the river look furred, as if it had grown a coat. The fallen cottonwood lay like a downed bridge, branches shouldering the current. Along the near bank, the new grave was simply a darker shape inside the dark, the flat river stone a gray coin under the shadow of leaves. The stallion's head hung low, not defeated, not quite. More like a weight he chose to carry where it belonged. Wind pulled at his mane and tail. Water slicked his coat until it shone. Lightning stitched a line behind the ridgeline, sharp enough to etch every fence post and sagebrush in white for a heartbeat. Thunder followed with a long, rolling body. Emma felt it in her ribs. She felt it in the porch boards. She felt the answering pressure in the sky, as if the valley itself were taking a breath it couldn't let out. The rain thickened. Between strikes, the land tightened down into gray. She tracked the stallion and forced herself to look for the other things that storms bring: cattle pressing to low spots, a loose calf nosing a gap in the wire, the faint white tail of a coyote moving like a thought along a draw. Everything else held. The only motion that mattered was the river, and the horse by it who would not be moved. Inside the house, the lights flickered once, then steadied. Emma didn't go in. The porch gave her height and angle and a straight line of sight. Lucas stood to her left, shoulder almost touching, binoculars up as well. Rain drummed on the tin roof in a fast, tight pattern that turned into a single sound. The cottonwoods traded coins in their invisible hands. Far off, something metallic clanged. Loose gate or windmill tail, but the ranch carried itself through it, boards creaking and bolts holding and water finding the paths it always finds. Wind changed, just a notch. Just to shift the river's voice from whisper to low-throated insistence. The stallion felt it too. His head came up a fraction, ears slicing forward, not just aware but chosen focus-aware, the way a dog locks on a far whistle. Emma tracked the line of his attention and swept the water with the glasses, methodical. Upstream of the cottonwood, the snag tangle at mid-channel, the eddy where the bank curved. At first there was nothing but brown water welded to motion. The surface wrinkled under the hammer of rain. Then a shape where there shouldn't be one. Small, pale at one edge, in and out of sight between the branch stubs. The river lifted it, set it down. Lifted, set it down. The shape rolled and a nose broke the surface. The quick, desperate hook of a muzzle searching air. It vanished and came up again, so close to the cottonwood that the line between saving and losing seemed paper thin. Emma didn't think in sentences. Her body made a bright, electric decision, and was already moving. She slung the binoculars down on the strap and took the porch steps 2 at a time. Mud grabbed at her boots. She didn't let it. Behind her, the screen door snapped, and Lucas was moving too, grabbing the waterproof kit and a coiled length of lead rope from the hook by the tack room. The yard blurred. Gate, path, grass lashing against their jeans. The river loud now, not background, not music, command. The stallion was faster than both of them. He exploded from his stillness like a sprung wire, throwing power into the ground and then into the water without a broken beat. Spray lifted in sheets around his chest as he drove in. He didn't charge mindless at the small, drowning thing. He angled with a fighter's sense, quartering into the current so the river would spend itself against him and spare what he meant to reach. He used his body like a wall, like a boat hull, ribs turning the flow. Shoulder cutting through floating debris with that egoless precision animals have when the stakes are not abstract. Emma and Lucas hit the bank, but stopped short of the drop where the flood had undercut. There was no smart way in from here. The cottonwood was a trap, a tangle of underwater arms ready to drag any second thing that touched it into the same death. Emma scanned for an entrance, a gravel fan, a shallower riffle, something that would let a human body help instead of add to the problem. The rain made it hard to see. The stallion made it harder to look anywhere else. He took a hit from a spinning limb on the foreleg and folded his weight over it, then recovered, then pushed on. The foal, Emma could see now the smaller shape, was very much alive, surfaced squarely against the stallion's side for a second. He tucked his head, shouldered, and took the impact of a branch that would have snapped a neck that size. The foal's muzzle cleared and got a breath. Another second, and it would be gone again, snatched toward the snag and into the silver-gray teeth of the branches. Lucas shouted something short that the wind tore away and pointed downstream, where a ribbon of calmer water slicked along the near bank. If the stallion could hold the foal against his shoulder and swing, if they could make that tiny corridor of mercy, Emma felt the map of the river in her head redraw itself in a rush, the kind of recalculation you do at a dead run. The stallion gathered and heaved. He didn't look strong so much as inevitable. For one naked instant, the current put them both crosswise and the foal vanished. Then the horse's hip hit a standing wave and turned the whole equation 15 degrees. The foal bobbed up in the narrow seam of slack water, legs thrashing, head barely clear. Emma was already running downstream to meet what might be coming, rope uncoiling in her hand, boots slipping, heart hard in her throat. The storm opened wider, as if the sky had decided that whatever was going to happen needed to happen under full witness. Lightning stitched the ridge again. The river said yes or no in its single voice. On the bank, Emma's breath went raw and thin. In the water, the stallion drove, angled, and tried to make a miracle out of instinct and grit. And somewhere under the hammering rain, a small, ragged whinny cut through like a knife. The river took the sound of that whinny and shredded it into rain. But it was enough to show where the small life still clung. A pale flash of muzzle, a knot of legs, a brief, frantic churn. Then the current tried to fold the foal back under the cottonwood's drowned lattice. The stallion read the water like a map he'd carried all his life. He set his chest into the force coming off mid-channel and let his body become a breakwater. The first rush battered him sideways. He bent into it and made the river choose between his ribs and the small shadow tucked against him. Hooves found stuttered footing on stones he couldn't see. He slid, checked, and drove again, shoulder taking the hit from a spinning limb so the foal didn't have to. The branch glanced off with a hollow crack and went end over end downstream, useless as a spent idea. Emma ran the bank, breath knifing in and out, rope uncoiling in her fist. She reached the slick ribbon of calm Lucas had spotted, a seam where the flooded edge had carved a narrow shelf. Water there moved with speed, but not malice. She skidded to her knees at the lip, boots scrabbling for purchase in new-cut clay. Lucas dropped beside her, wrapped the tail of the rope around his forearm, and braced his boots against a snagged root. Rain hammered their backs so hard, it felt like handfuls of thrown gravel. The foal surfaced again, eyes rolled white. Nostrils flared to saucers, legs bicycling against nothing. The stallion pivoted, hip to current, and nudged with the blunt insistence of an animal that understands the difference between drift and choice. The foal skated out of the boil and into the seam. It wasn't salvation, not yet, but it was a corridor that pointed toward Emma's hands. She threw the rope low and flat. It kissed the water, sank, and a turn wrapped by luck around a tiny chest. The foal's panic threatened to undo the gift in a second. Legs kicked, the loop tightened in the wrong place. Water took advantage. Emma set her weight and slid, mud taking her forward another foot. Lucas dropped his center of gravity and turned into a post. The rope came alive against their palms, burning heat through wet gloves. For a breath, everything stopped. The foal hung, the stallion held, the river considered. Then the three of them, horse, human, took the same step without agreeing to it. Emma leaned back, elbows locked. Lucas sank lower, spine straight. The stallion surged, shoulder to water, and added the small, critical angle that turned drag into lift. The foal bumped against the shelf, slid, scrambled, found a purchase with one hoof, lost it, found it again, collapsed onto the gravel bar like a tent slumping on wet ground. Emma was already there. She let the rope go and caught the small body with both arms, absorbing the shuddering weight that felt like nothing and everything at once. Water poured off the foal in a sheet. The chest heaved. A ragged cough shook her ribs under her hands. For an instant, the heart beat rabbit-fast under skin slicked with river and silt, then faster still, then steadier. "Here," Lucas said, or maybe just breathed, and pushed the waterproof kit into the shelter of Emma's body. She dragged it open with her teeth, hands not willing to leave the foal long enough to be clever. A thermal blanket found its shape in the wind and tried to fly. Lucas pinned one corner. She wrapped the foal tight, nose free, chest free, heat trapped where heat mattered. The tiny body trembled in jerks that made her jaw tighten. Trembling meant fighting. Trembling meant something left to spend. The stallion climbed the shelf in 2 hard steps that put him above them, not on them. He stood with the river running off his legs in ropes and watched, every line of him drawn between storm and shelter. Lightning flare lit him in negative, bone and tendon and will. Then the dark fell back over his shoulders. He lowered his head until the breath from his nostrils warmed the foal's face. The little one answered that warmth with a thin, stubborn sound that cut through the rain again. Less knife this time, more thread. Emma kept her motions small. A slick hand cleared silt from the foal's nostrils. Another pressed gently along the ribs, feeling for rhythm, for effort. The blanket clung, rain beating and rolling. Lucas carved a shallow wedge into the gravel with his heel to drain the pooling water. The river climbed and fell a fraction, as if taking stock of what it hadn't taken. The foal tried to stand too soon and collapsed sideways. A heartbeat later, She tried again with the irrational courage that belongs to the very young and the very old. Emma blocked with her forearm, turned the attempt into a better angle, and let gravity tip in their favor. Tiny hooves found the mat of grass above the gravel. Knees shook. Sinew flickered. The foal held on her feet for a count of 3, fell, and held for 4 on the next try. The stallion shifted, not forward, not back. Just a recalibration of weight that made space without ceding ground. He was not domestic. He was not tamed by gratitude. He was a wild thing solving a problem with other bodies near his own. He flicked an ear toward the cottonwood, toward the grave under the larger tree, as if the map of his day still included those coordinates, even while this new point demanded all of him. Rain strung his lashes. He blinked and did not take his eyes off the foal. Emma guided the small body one step at a time up from the wet margin into grass that hadn't yet surrendered to flood. Every blade bent under water and sprang back, throwing fresh scent into the air. Chlorophyll and mud and the iron breath of the storm. Lucas shrugged out of his jacket, added its weight over the blanket, and checked the gums with a quick, practiced pressure. Pale to pink. Better than before. Not good. Better. Wind veered again and slapped cold across the back of Emma's neck. The storm had swung wider, bringing the kind of horizontal rain that means the heart of it has passed, but refuses to leave without a parting shot. Thunder rolled away toward the far hills with a tired growl. The brightness that followed wasn't sunlight so much as the sky remembering how to be itself. The river's voice dropped a notch. The foal steadied. Breath smoothed from frantic to fast, from fast to counting pace. She turned her head and found the stallion's muzzle with her own. For a long, spare second, they held there, touch light as moth wings, the smallest possible bridge over a very large distance. Then the foal wobbled and leaned into Emma's thighs, choosing a different kind of balance. The stallion looked from the foal to Emma and back, an assessment that felt like being weighed for weight's sake, not judgment. He took one step to the side, clearing the space that led inland. He did not move farther. He had another place to stand when this was done, and everyone there seemed to know it. Headlights cut the rain, 2 clean coins swinging through cottonwood trunks on the ranch road, then flattening into white bars as a truck nosed down toward the pasture gate. Tires hissed in the wet. A door slammed. Footsteps pounded. A voice carried in the new, thinner air. A single name shot across the distance with all the force a young heart can put behind it. The foal's ears flicked. The stallion's head rose a fraction. Emma tightened the blanket's edge and set her boots, ready for whatever came next. Noah Whitaker's frame came into view through the misting rain. Tall, broad-shouldered under a soaked flannel, boots flinging water with each stride. His cap was gone, hair plastered to his forehead. His voice came again, louder this time, the syllables carrying the panic of someone who has been searching for hours. The foal jerked her head toward him, legs shifting under the blanket. Emma felt the tremor of recognition ripple through the small body. A fragile whinny broke from the foal's throat, the sound frayed but determined. Noah didn't slow until the stallion stepped into his path. It wasn't aggressive, no snaking neck, no lunge, but the roan's body was a wall, deliberate and solid, water still dripping from his mane. Ears forward, eyes hard, he stood between the young man and the trembling shape wrapped in Emma's arms. Noah froze, chest heaving. His gaze cut from the stallion to Emma, silently asking. Emma shifted the blanket just enough to show the foal's face. She's alive, Emma called over the hiss of rain, her voice low but carrying. Cold and tired, but she's here. The stallion's eyes flicked to the foal, then back to Noah, holding the moment like a coin he wasn't sure about trading. Lucas, still kneeling near the gravel bar, spoke just loud enough to thread between thunder and wind. He'll move if he believes she's safe. Let him read it. Noah dropped to one knee in the wet grass, lowering his head, hands open in front of him. He didn't reach. He didn't push. His voice dropped to a tone only the foal, and maybe the stallion, could truly hear. Come on, girl. You're all right now. I'm here. The rain softened to a steady mist. For a long, taut heartbeat, nothing changed. Then the stallion's tail gave a slow sweep, and he shifted his weight half a step to the side. Not away, not conceding, just making a gap wide enough for the foal to choose. Emma loosened her hold. The foal wobbled forward, legs trembling, blanket trailing behind like a shed skin. She took 3 unsteady steps, then pressed her muzzle into the front of Noah's chest with the full force of a survivor's relief. Noah's arms folded around her, his body curling protectively over her damp frame. Lucas stood and exhaled through his teeth, a sound that carried more release than any words. Emma stepped back, letting the reunion hold center. The stallion watched for another beat, head lowering just enough for his nostrils to brush the foal's ear. She flicked it, turned her head toward him, and in that soft touch, there was a goodbye too large for language. Noah looked up at Emma. I thought she was gone. Been riding both sides of the valley since morning, calling till my voice was shot. How? He cut himself off, shaking his head. You and him? Emma nodded toward the roan. Mostly him. The young breeder's eyes found the stallion again. But the wild horse had already begun to turn. His body angled toward the riverbank, hooves sinking slightly in the softened ground. He didn't hurry. He didn't look back. Every step was measured, as though a tether invisible to everyone else still bound him to the place where the grave lay under the cottonwood. Emma felt the pull of it too. She had seen animals carry grief, but this was a vigil and a farewell in one. The stallion climbed the bank with the same unbroken rhythm he'd used to enter the water earlier, only now his mane hung heavier, and his shape was cut against a sky trying to brighten after the storm. Thunder muttered in the far distance. The land smelled clean again, grass bruised underfoot, earth breathing out the rain. Water still whispered against the gravel bar where moments ago it had roared. Noah gathered the foal in his arms, the small body limp with exhaustion, but alive. We'll get her in the truck, warmed up, checked over, he said, half to himself, half to Emma. Lucas moved to lead the way, his boots sucking free of the mud with each step. Emma stayed where she was for a moment longer, watching the stallion pause beside the cottonwood. He lowered his head over the fresh mound, mane falling forward to veil his face. The river's voice filled the pause. Then he straightened, gave a final flick of his tail, and stepped into the open plains. He didn't break into a run. He simply walked until the wet grass and the silvering light swallowed him whole, leaving no more sound than the breeze through the sedge. When Emma finally turned toward the waiting truck, Noah had settled the foal onto the back seat, wrapped in every dry layer they could spare. The young horse's breathing was easier now, eyes half-lidded, the fight in her muscles eased but not gone. Emma swung the passenger door shut and glanced once more toward the horizon. Somewhere out there, a gray roan stallion was moving alone, carrying his loss into the kind of wide silence only the plains can hold. She hoped, though she didn't know if hope had any place in this, that the land would be gentler to him now, that he'd find his herd again, that the grave by the cottonwood would keep what it held in peace. The truck's engine turned over, and they rolled toward the ranch house, taillights glowing dim against the washed air. Behind them, the storm's edge lifted off the hills, and a narrow band of pale blue cracked open overhead, as if the sky itself had decided to let go. The road up from the pasture was a long exhale through wet grass and puddled ruts, the truck humming a steady note that felt like a promise it meant to keep. Rain thinned to a mist that clung to the windows and gathered in tiny beads on the glass. In the back seat, the foal lay mummied in blankets and jackets, ribs lifting in fast, shallow strokes, eyes half closed in the exhausted way of something still counting its breaths. Noah held her head gently between his hands to keep it level. Lucas watched the rise and fall from the front, counting without looking like he was counting. Emma kept her eyes on the two-lane that climbed toward the house, hands loose on the wheel because tight hands never made a road shorter. Power lines sang in the wind. The cottonwoods stood like wet sentries. Where the flood had chewed the shoulder away, someone had hammered in a warning stake with a strip of fluorescent tape that fluttered like a heartbeat. The ranch house came into view with the porch light burning steady, a small star nailed to the weather. Emma didn't remember turning it on. Maybe it had never gone off. They worked without speaking. The mudroom became a field clinic in a minute. Towels stacked on the bench. A space heater dragged close enough to warm without scorching. The concrete mopped dry with old saddle blankets. Lucas's kit opened itself under his hands. Stethoscope, digital thermometer, a coil of IV line, a bag of warmed fluids wrapped in a towel that steamed like a kettle. He checked gums, pinched skin for return, listened to lungs. Each motion had the unhurried clarity of long practice, even as the edges of the night pressed in. The foal tried to stand and failed, legs scribbling, hooves slipping on the towels. Noah steadied her, then learned not to. Learned to put his hands against the air near her shoulders and let her find the first small anchors herself. Emma slid a folded feed sack under the towels to give traction, then another. The heater hummed and threw a dry warmth that softened the stiff in their hands. Lucas's voice came quiet and even. Warm, not hot. Hydrate slow. Watch for the cough-growing teeth. He said the rest with his eyes, a reminder that aspiration can curl in later, that the river has ways of returning after it's left your body. They named the foal by accident when Noah whispered the sound he'd been calling since morning, a single syllable wearing the edge of a prayer. Lark. The name clung to her in the room's low light and stayed, as if the night itself had accepted it and set it where it belonged. Outside, the storm took its complaint up valley and grumbled there. Water pattered from the porch roof in a slower rhythm. Somewhere in the yard, the wind chime no one had hung, just an old spoon on a leather thong, tapped the wall like a polite guest. The house smelled of hay dust, coffee gone cool, wet wool, the mild sharpness of disinfectant. Every now and then, the refrigerator motor came on and reminded them the lights hadn't failed yet. Time folded. Minutes lost their edges and blended into the more important work of breath counts and temperature checks and the steady drip of warmed saline into a vein that Lucas found with a quick, sure touch. Lark's shivering moved from violent to purposeful to intermittent. The tremor that had once looked like panic became the body's way of building heat. Then it became less, and the blanket's weight took over. Emma set a pot to boil because it felt like a thing the living do, then forgot about it until a thin, keening whistle lifted above the heater's hum. She turned off the burner and left the pot where it was, the steam evening out the room's bite. Noah leaned back against the washer, eyes fixed on Lark's face, lips moving with words that had less to do with language than with rhythm. Lucas drew numbers on a notepad that no one would ever file. Temp trending up from frightening to possible, respiration counting down from frantic to working speed, capillary refill coming back from winter to early spring. The first real trouble came quiet. Lark exhaled and did not inhale again quick enough for anyone's comfort. A pause opened. Not long. Long enough. Emma felt it like a skipped step on stairs, and her stomach dropped an inch. Lucas already had the stethoscope in place, already shifting the blanket, already positioning her head to clear an airway that might have collected what rain and river had left behind. A cough pressed under his hand and refused to form. Another pause. "Come on," Noah breathed, the word barely a sound. Lark gathered an ugly, necessary breath and hacked up a rope of water that smelled of mud and leaves. The cough ratcheted into something that sounded too big for her chest. Then air chose to stay. The next inhale was thin, the next less thin. Lucas nodded once, small, satisfied, and made a mark that wasn't numbers at all. Just a line into the night saying, "Not yet. Not on my watch." They let her rest. They didn't let her sleep too deep. Each time her head tilted toward that dangerous angle of surrender, Emma slid a folded towel to change the geometry of gravity. Each time a tremor threatened to turn to a stillness too smooth, Noah rubbed the small muscle where neck meets shoulder until life answered back. The heater hummed, pulled, clicked, hummed again. When fatigue finally found them, it picked the softest corners and left the work intact. Emma's shoulders sagged and straightened. Lucas's hands slowed and sharpened again. Noah's face carried that raw, scraped look of a man who has met the thought of losing and declined the meeting for now. Outside, coyotes tuned the edges of the world with thin, questioning notes. The house held. Near midnight, the power flickered. Once, twice. It held the third time, and in the steady light, Lark lifted her head and searched the air as if hearing something the others couldn't. The memory of river or the absence of hoofbeats. She let it go with a sigh that wasn't quite defeat and wasn't quite relief, and laid the small weight of her muzzle against Noah's wrist, as if anchoring herself to the human peace of the night. Emma stepped onto the porch for a minute to rinse the sound of coughs out of her head with the wider sound of the dripping yard. The air was cold enough to make the wet on her shirt wake up. Out beyond the fence, the pasture rolled away into black blue, the kind of darkness that's not empty but full of held breath. She looked toward the bend in the river, where a flat stone now lay under a large cottonwood, and let the quiet consider her. When she went back inside, Lucas had tucked the IV line away and was letting Lark pull at a bottle with a stubborn, clumsy focus that made his mouth tilt with approval. Not hunger, not yet. The will that comes before hunger. Noah's shoulders had dropped an inch. The world's wheel clicked one notch toward morning. They took turns with the blanket and the bottle and the listening. They took turns closing their eyes for 10 minutes at a time, with the kind of trust you can only build in a day like this. Each time the house creaked, Emma thought of the stallion walking into the open country, with rain in his mane and grief at his side, and she let the thought stand there without polishing it down to comfort. When the window over the sink finally paled a shade lighter than the room, birds she couldn't see started saying their names in the hedgerow. Lark's breath had settled into a rhythm that a person could listen to without counting. The heater clicked off, and the air didn't bite right away. Morning gathered itself at the edges of the yard, like a witness willing to speak. Before any of them reached for a phone, before the ranch woke fully, before the day began asking for fences and invoices and hay decisions, Emma knew the story wouldn't live only here. Tracks had already been laid, footprints in mud, tire marks on the lane, a roan's vigil by the river, a flat stone on a grave. The valley had a way of carrying news the way water carries silt, slow everywhere, settling where it will. She didn't know the shape it would take. She only knew that every shape began with breath, and for now, in this small room, breath was happening. By the time the sun fully cleared the eastern ridge, the storm's wreckage looked almost harmless in the early light. Puddles glittered like scraps of sky on the ranch road, fence wire winked where raindrops clung, and the river had taken on a dull, steady sheen, no longer boiling, but still carrying the weight of what it had claimed. Lark stood on her own by mid-morning, legs narrow as saplings, knees still quivering from the long night. Noah knelt beside her with one hand resting light on her shoulder, as if the smallest pressure might keep her anchored. Lucas packed away the last of his equipment, methodical as always, and left a folded note with dosages, feeding intervals, and warning signs scrawled in neat block letters. Emma stepped out onto the porch to let the damp air rinse the close smell of the sick room from her skin. The cottonwoods along the bend were backlit in gold, their leaves moving with that slow, lazy rhythm that comes after a storm spends itself. Somewhere down there, out of sight now, the stallion's hoofprints would already be blurring into the grass. She wondered if he'd stopped to rest, or if grief had kept him moving through the dark until distance became its own kind of shelter. She didn't have long to think before the sound of tires crunched up the gravel lane. A white county truck rolled into the yard, the seal of the Wyoming Department of Wildlife printed on the door. A tall man in a windbreaker stepped out, scanning the porch before tipping his chin in greeting. "Morning, Miss Caldwell. Heard you had a situation with one of our wild bands," he said. His badge read Harlan, and his voice carried the flat vowels of someone who'd lived his whole life inside the same mountain shadows. Emma nodded, motioning toward the barn. "We've got a foal in there. Found her in the river last night. She's stable now." Harlan followed her inside, pausing when he saw Lark. "Lucky," he murmured. "That current's taken plenty this season." He crouched, keeping his hands to himself, eyes measuring the foal's stance. "Where's her dam?" Noah shook his head. "Didn't see her, just the stallion. Gray roan, scar on the shoulder. He pulled her out himself." That made Harlan look up sharp. "A stallion did that?" Emma met his gaze. "You'd have to see it to believe it." "I did." The warden straightened, scribbling in a small notebook. "I've heard of them guarding their dead, never pulling a live one out." He hesitated. "We'll need to decide what to do about her. She's young. Without a band, she's got slim odds in the wild this winter." Noah's jaw tightened. "She's staying with me. I've got the pasture, I've got the time. She's already bonded." Harlan's eyes shifted between them, weighing what rules could bend. "I'll have to file the report, but..." He closed the notebook. "Given the circumstances, I don't see anyone arguing." They talked through the details, ear tags, medical checks, the quiet understanding that some stories didn't need to be dressed up for official paperwork. Harlan left with a nod toward the cottonwoods. "If that roan's still down there, you might see him once more before he drifts. Keep your eyes open." When the truck pulled away, silence returned to the yard. broken only by the drip of water from the eaves. Emma leaned against the porch post, eyes narrowing toward the bend. It was almost noon when she saw him, a gray shape far down the pasture, moving with that same measured, unhurried gait. He didn't come close, just traced the fence line until it reached the river, then stood with his head angled toward the barn as if taking stock from a distance. Emma stepped off the porch without meaning to, boots sinking in the softened ground. She stopped halfway to the fence, not wanting to push him. The stallion's ears flicked once, catching the movement. Then he turned, walking the narrow strip between grass and water until the cottonwoods swallowed him from sight. Back in the barn, Lark took a few tottering steps toward the open door, nostrils flaring at the scent that drifted in. Noah steadied her, but Emma saw the way her ears pointed, the way her head tilted, not toward the yard, but toward the direction where the river curved. The rest of the day folded into chores: fence repair on the west pasture, a trip to town for feed and supplies, the low hum of normal ranch life pushing against the sharp edges of the night before. Still, the image of the stallion standing by the cottonwood grave threaded itself through everything Emma did. That evening, when the sun burned low over the hills and painted the wet grass in long strokes of orange, Emma found herself back on the porch, binoculars in hand. The river glinted in the distance, steady and unhurried now, but she knew better than to think it harmless. She scanned the far bank until the light faded into shadow, but the stallion didn't show again. Whether he'd gone to rejoin a band or slipped farther into the hills, she couldn't guess. All she knew was that his absence felt deliberate, like a chapter closed without fanfare. Inside, Lark dozed in the straw, her breathing deep and even. Noah sat cross-legged beside her, one hand resting lightly on her neck. Lucas had gone, leaving a promise to check in after 2 days. The quiet in the barn was the good kind, the kind that held safety instead of waiting for the next strike. Emma shut the door against the cooling air and let the night take the yard. Somewhere out there in the long sweep of grass and sky, the stallion was moving under the same stars that crowned the ranch. She hoped the land would carry him gently, the way he had carried that small life through the river. And she knew, without quite deciding it, that she'd be watching the bend in the days to come. Some debts weren't written down, but stayed just as clear. The morning broke clear, the air rinsed clean of storm and heavy with the scent of damp earth. Sunlight spilled across the pastures in long, warm stripes, and for the first time in days, the clear water looked calm, its surface broken only by the lazy ripple of trout rising to feed. Emma woke early, restless. She poured black coffee into a chipped enamel mug and stepped out onto the porch. The boards still held a faint chill under her bare feet. Her gaze, as it had every morning since the rescue, went instinctively toward the bend in the river. Nothing moved there except the shimmer of cottonwood leaves and the drifting shadow of a hawk. In the barn, Lark was already up on her feet when Emma came in, ears pricked, her small body steadier than the day before. Noah was brushing her with slow, careful strokes, murmuring under his breath. The foal leaned into the touch, eyes half-lidded in contentment. She had that look now, less fragile, more determined, as if her muscles were finally listening to her heart's insistence. "You're turning into trouble," Noah said with a faint grin. "Another couple weeks and I won't be able to keep up with you." Emma poured grain into a shallow pan. The sound drew Lark's attention instantly, and she stepped toward it without hesitation. Her appetite had been growing steadily, a good sign, Lucas had said, and today she finished the ration in record time, muzzle dusted with flecks of grain. By late morning, Lucas's pickup crunched up the drive. He ducked into the barn, gave Lark a once-over, and smiled. "She's looking good. Better muscle tone. Breathing's clean. You've done right by her." He checked her pulse, her gait, the reflexive flick of her ears when he clapped softly behind her. "If she keeps trending this way, she'll be running circles around you by next week." Noah's relief was plain. "I don't care if she runs me ragged. Just want her running." Lucas jotted a few more notes, then glanced at Emma. "Any sign of him?" Emma shook her head. "Not since the morning after, but I've been watching." Lucas's expression turned thoughtful. "Sometimes they linger longer than you expect. Sometimes they vanish like smoke. Either way, he did what most wouldn't. That's not something you forget." They worked quietly for a while, cleaning stalls, setting fresh bedding, but around mid-afternoon, the peace cracked. From the porch, Emma caught movement far down the pasture, a shape threading the grass with the slow, deliberate confidence she recognized instantly. The stallion. He moved along the fence line, not grazing, not aimless. His head was high, ears forward, scanning. The sunlight caught in his roan coat, bringing out the deep slate under the dapples. Scars showed sharper in the bright light, the mark on his shoulder, the healed bite on his neck. Emma called softly to Noah, who came out wiping his hands. His eyes widened. "You weren't kidding about him." Lark had already caught the scent. She lifted her head, nostrils flaring, legs shifting as if pulled forward by something older than her short memory. Noah stepped in front of her, not to block, but to steady her as she tried to move toward the open door. The stallion didn't come closer than the far fence. He stood, watching, the way he had on that first day by the river. Emma could feel the weight of his gaze even across the distance. "What's he doing?" Noah asked quietly. Emma shook her head. "Checking, making sure." For several minutes, nothing else moved. The stallion's tail flicked once, his ears tilted toward the barn, toward the small form pressing at the stall door. The air between them was thick with a kind of recognition that didn't need names. Then, as if satisfied, he turned. Not quickly, just a smooth pivot into the wind, and began walking back toward the cottonwoods. The sunlight followed him, catching in the shifting planes of muscle under his coat. He didn't look back. Noah exhaled. "You think that's the last time?" "Could be," Emma said. "Could be he's just making sure the story ended the way it should." The rest of the day passed in that strange quiet that follows an unspoken farewell. Lark settled back into her straw, dozing in patches of sunlight that fell through the open barn doors. Noah sat nearby, idly mending a leather halter. Emma kept glancing toward the bend, even though she knew the pasture there was empty now. As dusk came on, the sky burned orange and purple over the hills. The river, lit from beneath by the last rays, looked almost tame. But Emma knew better. She also knew that somewhere beyond those cottonwoods, a gray roan stallion was moving through the wide, wild country with the same unhurried strength he had shown in the river. And she thought, though she couldn't prove it, that for as long as Lark lived here, she would always be under the watch of a shadow that didn't need to be seen to be present. The next morning came without warning in the form of a deep, still silence. No wind in the cottonwoods, no creak of the porch boards under a shifting gust, just the faint tick of the clock in the kitchen and the slow drip of water from the eaves. Emma knew that kind of quiet. It was the pause before something final. She dressed quickly, boots still damp from yesterday, and stepped outside with her coffee. The valley was washed in silver light, the sun barely over the ridge. The grass still held the sheen of night. Each blade tipped with a drop that caught the early light like glass. She scanned the far pasture without thinking, and there he was. The stallion stood by the cottonwood, not grazing, not restless. Just there, facing the river, head low, tail hanging still. The grave lay between him and the water, the flat stone gleaming faintly under the morning sun. Emma set her coffee on the porch rail and went back inside to fetch the binoculars. Through the lenses, she saw every detail: the scars on his hide, the wet black line of his nostrils in the cool air, the way his ears shifted only slightly, as if listening for something just beyond hearing. He wasn't watching for danger. He wasn't waiting for company. This was the look of someone who had come to finish what he had started. In the barn, Lark was already awake, nudging Noah for her morning feed. The foal's steps were steadier now, her weight better under her. But when Emma walked past the stall, she noticed the way Lark's ears turned toward the pasture. That invisible thread was still there. Emma leaned on the doorframe. "He's back." Noah looked up sharply. "Here?" "By the cottonwood." Lucas had promised to check on Lark again that morning, and when his truck pulled into the yard minutes later, Emma met him halfway. She didn't explain. She just pointed toward the bend. Lucas followed her gaze, his face tightening. They didn't ride out. They didn't call. They walked, taking the long way through the pasture, keeping their steps slow and even. The grass whispered underfoot, wet enough to darken the leather of their boots. The closer they came, the more the air seemed to thicken, not with weather, but with the sense that whatever was about to happen had already been decided. The stallion didn't move when they reached the outer edge of his comfort distance. He lifted his head slightly, eyes passing over them without challenge. For a long moment, the only sound was the river murmuring around the fallen cottonwood. Emma stopped just far enough that the grave sat between her and the roan. The stone was darker now, the soil settled. She felt the urge to say something aloud, but the words never came. Some moments didn't need to be narrated. The stallion lowered his head over the mound. His muzzle brushed the stone lightly, as if he were tracing the shape of it into memory. He stood like that for several breaths, unmoving, until a breeze caught in his mane and set it drifting. Then he straightened, gave a slow flick of his tail, and turned. Not toward them, not back to the river, but toward the open plains that stretched beyond the cottonwoods. His stride was unhurried, each step deliberate. He didn't glance back. They watched until his shape became a smaller and smaller mark against the grass, until the shadows of the hills began to take him. In the final slant of morning light, he looked less like a living thing and more like part of the land itself, gray as stone, strong as wind, impossible to hold. Lucas broke the silence first, his voice low. "That's a good goodbye." Emma nodded, though her throat was too tight to answer. By the time they turned back toward the barn, the stallion was gone from sight. Lark stood at the stall door, ears forward, watching the same direction they had come from. Emma reached in and brushed her neck with the back of her hand. The foal leaned into it, her warmth grounding Emma in the here and now. Noah joined them, resting his forearms on the top rail. "So that's it?" "For him," Emma said. "For us. Maybe just the start." The rest of the day passed in the slow rhythm of ranch work, mending a section of fence by the south pasture, clearing debris the flood had left tangled in the lower fields, feeding the herd. But each time Emma looked toward the horizon, She thought she caught the faintest movement where the hills met the sky, like the ghost of a shadow still traveling. That night, the air was sharp with the smell of cooling earth. Stars wheeled out over the valley, clear and bright after days of cloud. Emma stood on the porch until her coffee went cold in her hands, thinking about the stallion's vigil, his rescue, his final walk away. She didn't know where he'd go, or if she'd ever see him again. But she knew this. The wide country had a way of carrying stories just as surely as the river carried silt. And somewhere out there, under the same sky, that gray roan was still moving, leaving behind a grave under a cottonwood, and taking with him the proof that love and loss could ride the same trail. In the days that followed, word of the rescue moved through the valley the way news always had, passed over coffee counters, murmured in feed store aisles, carried on the wind between fence posts. At first, it was just neighbors and ranch hands who'd heard, each adding their own color to the telling. Then someone's niece posted a photo online. Noah in the barn doorway, Lark wrapped in a blanket, steam from her breath curling into the cold air. The caption was simple: saved from the river by a wild stallion. From there, it spread faster than Emma could keep track of. Local reporters called. A wildlife photographer showed up unannounced, asking if he could see the bend in the river where it happened. By the end of the week, a national outlet had picked up the story, running side-by-side images of Lark in the barn and the stallion, shot from a distance, standing over the cottonwood grave. Emma wasn't much for the attention, but she understood the pull of the story. There was something in it people wanted to believe, that wildness could be merciful, that loss could give birth to a kind of courage. Lucas handled the interviews with his usual steady calm, focusing on the stallion's instincts, on the resilience of the foal. Noah, younger and more open-faced, spoke about the bond forming between him and Lark, about the way she'd started following him around the pasture like a shadow. Emma stayed mostly quiet, though once, when pressed, she said, "Some things you see, you keep. Not because they're yours to own, but because they're too rare to let go." That quote made it into print more than she expected. The attention brought more than talk. Donations began arriving, small bills folded into envelopes, checks with notes scrawled in the margins. For the foals, for the wild ones, for the roan. It was Lucas who first suggested doing something with it beyond covering Lark's feed. By the end of the month, the Wyoming Wild Horse Protection Foundation had a name, a bank account, and a mission statement: to safeguard the state's wild herds, protect their habitat, and educate the public on their value. The stallion's image, a still frame from a long lens shot, head high against a sweep of grass, became the foundation's emblem. Emma found herself at the first meeting in the Grange Hall, sitting at a folding table beside Lucas and Noah, listening to volunteers talk about mapping water sources, lobbying against unnecessary roundups, and creating safe corridors between grazing lands. The stallion's story gave the cause a face people wouldn't forget. Back at the ranch, Lark's recovery turned a corner. Her legs grew steadier, her stride more confident. By early spring, she was galloping the length of Noah's pasture, mane tossing in the wind, her whinny sharp with the joy of movement. Emma would sometimes stop whatever she was doing just to watch, because in every line of her motion, she could still see the moment in the river when the stallion had turned the current in her favor. Every so often, Emma would ride the fence line down toward the cottonwoods. The grave was still there, the stone weathering under rain and sun, grass growing up around it. She never saw the stallion again, though once at dusk She found fresh tracks on the far bank, deep, deliberate prints leading from the river into the open hills. She didn't follow. Some journeys weren't meant to be interrupted. When summer came, the foundation held its first public gathering, drawing ranchers, wildlife officers, photographers, and families with children in tow. They told the story of the gray roan and the river, of Lark's survival, of what it meant for the wild herds still running free. Emma stood at the back, listening, the warm wind carrying the smell of cut hay and dust. She thought about the stallion's final walk away from the cottonwood, about the quiet dignity of it. No spectacle, no reward, just the understanding that his part was done. She thought about the way the land had swallowed his shape and kept moving, as it always did, as it always would. Later that evening, after the last truck had pulled away and the yard lights hummed over the quiet ranch, Emma sat on the porch with a mug of coffee gone cold. The stars were sharp above, the river a silver thread in the dark. Somewhere out there, beyond the reach of fences and headlights, a gray roan stallion was still part of this country. Its storms, its silences, its unbroken distances. She raised the mug in a small private salute. Not to call him back, not to claim his story, just to acknowledge that for a brief, fierce span of days, their trails had crossed, and in that crossing, something worth keeping had been made. In the weeks to come, she knew, Lark would grow strong enough to run with the wind at her heels. The foundation would find its footing. And the stallion's story, woven now into the fabric of the valley, would keep moving, the way all true things do, carried forward by the people who had seen and the people who wanted to believe. Love, grief, courage, they weren't bound by fences or species. And sometimes, in the shadow of loss, a single act of selflessness could light a path wide enough for others to follow. Emma took a slow breath, let it out into the cool night, and listened to the river's steady voice. It sounded like memory. It sounded like promise.